Hello everyone, it's Melanie here with Vintage Hill Studio. I'm so glad you joined me today. We'll be making this crafty card, and kudos for everyone who crafts or creates. This was so much fun. I picked this up from a creative stamping magazine from Crafter's Companion. It came with this set of stamps and a wonderful embossing folder. So let's get to it. I'll be working on a plain white cardstock panel. All dimensions can be found on my blog. And then I'm going to go through and pick some of my favorite stamps. I mean, look at this. It's adorable. It's got a stamp press, a die cutting machine, some scissors and a sewing machine and ink wells and a calligraphy pen and paintbrushes and tubes of paint and just on and on. Just adorable stamp set. This was one that I couldn't walk by without picking up, and I'm so happy I got it. The possibilities are endless, and the magazine has lots of examples to go by if you get stuck with your creativity. Anyway, I'll go through and get a few of these picked out, and then I'm going to move on to my StazOn ink. And I chose this because I'm going to be using some water-based markers. So I will just pick and choose images to fill my background. Here's that die cutting machine. Is that not adorable or what? All of these are so dang cute. I mean, you could go on and never create the same thing twice. There's a calligraphy pen. Anybody remember doing calligraphy? That's an lost art for sure. I'm moving on to doing this cute little paintbrush. And then I'll go on and fill in the rest of my background. Trying to not get too busy. I mean, there's so many to choose from. How can you not? It's hard to stop. So on the splotches and squiggles, I just moved on to one of my favorite inks. And you want to do this because if you try to stamp in black, you're just going to get black splotches and black squiggles. Not too interesting. But you can see I chose 3 colors and just went in 3s on my background. Here are some of the markers I'll be using. I tried to make sure I chose a light and a darker shade from each color family, just so as I move through coloring in my images, I have some highlights and shadows. So I went through and did the boring part first, which is all the grays, like on the scissor blades and the barrels of the paint brushes and so on. And then I'm going to speed along and add color. And this is where you want to make sure you have a brush marker that has both a brush end and a fine tip. Because as you can see from like the handles of the scissors and several of the other images have very fine details. So that fine point on your marker comes in very handy for these images. As I moved along, I was thinking about all of the things I have in my craft room. All of these items are reflected, things that we use almost every day. So I just have to say I have no judgment about that for anyone. I just get you, sister. This happens to all of us. And I could think of worse things. So using our crafting talents, not so bad. Anyway, this was fun, and I can't wait to get this into the hands of a crafty friend. Again, here I'm using some lights and darks to make sure I have shadows and highlights on all of my images. And as you'll see as we go through the video, I tried to disperse the color throughout the background so that I have some, upper, some in the lower, some in the middle range, and dispersed evenly throughout my background just to give it continuity and tie all of the colors together. So working on this little paint palette, one of the things I wanted to make sure that I did was as I added color to many of the other images, I would come back up and add a splotch of paint on this palette. And again, that's just for the continuity of the color throughout this whole background. I was working on the bottles. There's ink, there's a bottle of paint, a little canister to hold paint brushes, pencils, and it looks like a glue tube. Just so cute. If you look up towards the top, there's even a tube that has a little squiggle of paint being squished out. I mean, tell me if you could resist this whole stamp set. Just adorable. Because I was adding so much color to my background, I made sure that as I was thinking about putting this card together, I just chose a single color of a matte that would coordinate with some of the colors in my background, and just kept it very simple as far as the finishing touches for the card. Because I wanted this, of course, the star to be this background with all of these wonderful colors. So I'll just move along here, finishing up my coloring. I mean, this one of the stamps had the ink pad. I think that's what sold me on the whole stamp set, was seeing an ink pad in a stamp. So stinking cute. As I was finishing up my background, it looked a little plain even with the splotches and squiggles. So I'm going to go back to my stamp set, and there's a little cluster of dots. And my trick for using that is I chose a color out of the palette that I've already been using, which was on that bigger paintbrush, and I'm just going to go through and use that same color for the little dots. Then, so I did not cover up any of my handiwork there, I wanted to use vellum for the sentiment. And it comes with this word create with an F on the end. So you just cut your letters apart, and you can use them, however you want to. So I use the CREAT with a Versamark sticky ink because I'm going to be doing dry embossing. And I'm using my Tonic Studio stamping platform, which comes in very handy because I need to move the letter E to the end of my word to create the word create. So I'll get that situated, remove the other letters, and then stamp that final E on the end of my word. Then I simply bring over my embossing powder, which is a white powder from Recollections, and I use a coffee filter behind that. So I sprinkle on my powder, tap off the powder into my coffee filter, and then I'm going to bring over my heat tool. I've got a Marvy heat tool. I get that heated up, and as soon as it's warm to the touch, I can start melting my powder, and you'll know it's melted because it gets this sheen to it. Doesn't take very long on vellum to get your powder melted. And then I'm just going to eyeball this and cut a strip across. Oh, here's where the coffee filter comes in handy. I get that powder put right back into my container. I'm going to cut my strip out. And I made it a little longer than the width of my card so I can, when I want to adhere this to my card, I can adhere it from the back. Because if you ever try to adhere vellum, unless you can get behind those tiny little letters, your adhesive will show through the vellum. But by doing this little trick, I line this up on my grid so that I can get my sentiment strip straight. I bring over my little ball stylus, and I'm going to make a mark on each side of my vellum so that I know where to fold my vellum back. And again, it's kind of making like a little band that will go around the front of my card, and the tails will go on the back so that I can adhere them to the back of my card, and my vellum will not be compromised by any type of adhesive showing through the front. So again, I get that situated where I want it using my grid to help me align this so that it's straight. I'll flip it over, use my tape runner, pull that vellum tight, and give it a press. And there is my vellum sentiment on the front of my card. Again, just using a plain mat to back my little panel, and that will go on my 5x7" card. I got that all put together, and then for a little added detail, I used my Nuvo Crystal Drops, and I went over all the little paint on the palette and the paint splotches and so forth, and this will give it a nice wet look, as well as adding a little bit of dimension. Now it goes on milky, but when it dries, it will be clear. It will have just a little bit of dimension, and of course that sheen that gives it the wet paint look. And I'll give you a close-up look on that here in just a minute after it's dried, and you'll see what I'm talking about. All right. There's a close-up of our splotches, the inside of my card. That inside sentiment is also from the stamp set. And my lined envelope, I have several videos on YouTube on how to make your own easy peasy lined envelope with no dies or special measurements, so go take a look at that if you're interested in lining your envelopes. I hope you got inspired by this card today. And this, again, is to all my crafty friends. Happy crafting, everyone.